So, hello everyone. Hope you're doing great. Let's start with part number 3 of chapter 9, Growth of a New India, the Nationalist Movement from 1858 to 1905. We are going to start with the topic Constitutional Reforms. Here it goes. From the beginning of early nationalists believed that India should eventually move towards democratic self-government. But they did not ask for the immediate fulfillment of their goal. Their immediate demands were extremely moderate. They hoped to win freedom through gradual steps. They were also extremely cautious lest the government suppress their activities. From 1885 to 1892, they demanded the expansion and reform of the legislative councils. The British government was forced by their agitation to pass the Indian Councils Act of 1892. By this act, the number of members of the Imperial Legislative Council as well as the provincial councils was increased. Some of these members could be elected indirectly by Indians, but the official majority remained. The nationalists were totally dissatisfied with the Act of 1892 and declared it to be a hoax. They demanded a larger share for Indians in the councils as also wider powers for them. In particular, they demanded Indian control over the public purse and raided the slogans that had earlier become the national cry for American people during their War of Independence. No taxation without representation. At the same time, they failed to broaden the base of their democratic demands. They did not demand the right to vote for the masses or for women. By the beginning of 20th century, the nationalist leaders advanced further and put forward the claim for Swaraj or self-government within the British Empire on the model of self-governing colonies like Australia and Canada. This demand was made from the Congress platform by Gokhale in 1905 and by Dadabhai Naoroji in 1906. Administrative and other reforms. The early nationalists were fearless critics of individual administrative measures and worked incessantly for the reform of administrative system ridden with corruption, inefficiency and oppression. The most important administrative reform they desired was Indianization of the higher grades of the administrative services. They put forward this demand on economic, political, and moral grounds. Economically, the European monopoly of the higher services was harmful on the two grounds. Europeans were paid at very high rates, and this made Indian administration very costly. Indians of similar qualification could be employed on lower salaries. The Europeans sent out India a large part of their salaries and their pensions were paid in England. This added to the drain of wealth from India. Politically, the nationalists hoped that the Indianization of these services would make the administration more responsive to the Indian needs. The moral aspect of the question was stated by Gopal Krishna Gokhale in 1897. The excessive costliness of the foreign agency is not, however, its only evil. There is moral evil, which, if anything, is even greater. A kind of dwarfing or stunting of the Indian race is going on under the present system. We must live all the days of our life in an atmosphere of inferiority, and the tallest of us must bend. The full height of which our manhood is capable of rising can never be reached by us under the present system. The moral elevation which every self-government people feel cannot be felt by us. Our administrative and military talents must gradually disappear owing to the sheer disuse till at last our lot as hewers of wood and drawers of water in our own country is stereotyped. The nationalists demanded separation of the judicial from the executive powers so that the people might get some protection from the arbitrary acts and policies of the bureaucracy. They agitated against the oppressive and tyrannical behavior of the police and other government agencies towards the common people. They criticized the delays of the law and the high cost of judicial process. They opposed the aggressiveness of foreign policy against India's neighbors. They protested against the policy of annexation of Burma, the attack upon Afghanistan, and the suppression of the tribal people in the northwestern India. They urged the government to undertake and develop welfare activities of the state. They laid a great deal of emphasis on the spread of primary education among the masses. They also demanded greater facilities for the technical and higher education. They urged the development of agricultural banks to save the peasant from the clutches of the moneylender. They wanted the government to undertake a large scale program of extension of irrigation for the development of agriculture and save the country from famines. They demanded extension of medical and health facilities and the improvement of police system to make it honest, efficient and popular. The nationalist leaders also spoke up in defense of Indian workers who had been compelled by poverty to migrate to foreign countries such as South Africa, Malay, Mauritius and the West Indies and British Guinea in search of employment. Many of these foreign lands were subjected to severe oppression and racial discrimination. This was partially true in South Africa, where Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was leading a popular struggle in defense of basic human rights of Indians. Defense of civil rights. From the beginning, the politically conscious Indians had been powerfully attracted not only to the democracy but also to the modern civil rights, namely the freedom of speech, the press, thought, and association. They put up a strong defense of the civil rights whenever the government tried to curtail them. It was during this period, as a result of nationalist political work, that democratic ideas began to take root among the Indian people in general, the intelligentsia in particular. In fact, this struggle for democratic freedoms became an integral part of nationalist struggle for freedom. In 1897, the Bombay government arrested B.J. Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and several other leaders and newspaper editors and tried them, spreading disaffection against the government. They were sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. At the same time, two Pune leaders, the Natu brothers, were deported without trial. The entire country protested against this attack on the liberties of people. Tilak, here too known largely in Maharashtra, became overnight an all India leader. Methods of political work. The Indian national movement up to 1905 was dominated by leaders who have often been described as moderate nationalists or moderates. The political methods of the moderates can be summed up by briefly as constitutional agitation within the four walls of the law and slow, orderly political progress. They believed that if public opinion was created and organized and popular demands presented to the authorities through petitions, meetings, resolutions, and speeches, the authorities would concede to these demands gradually and step by step. Their political work had therefore a two-pronged direction. Firstly, to build up a strong public opinion in India, to arouse the political consciousness and a national spirit of people, and to educate and unite them on political questions. Basically, even the resolutions and petitions of the National Congress were directed towards this goal. Though ostensibly their memorials and petitions were addressed to the government, their real aim was to educate the Indian people. For example, when in 1891 a young Gokhale expressed disappointment at the two-line reply of the government to a carefully proposed memorial by the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha, Justice Ranade replied, "You don't realize our place in the history of our country. These memorials are normally addressed to the government. In reality, they are addressed to the people so that they may learn how to think in these matters. This work must be done for many years without expecting any other results, because politics of this kind is altogether new in this land." Secondly, the early nationalists wanted to persuade the British government and to British public opinion to introduce reforms along directions laid down by the nationalists. The moderate nationalists believed that British people and Parliament wanted to be just to India, but that they did not know the true state of affairs there. Therefore, next to educating Indian public opinion, the moderate nationalists worked to educate British public opinion. For this purpose, they carried out active propaganda in Britain. Deputations of leading Indians were sent to Britain to propagate the Indian view. In 1889, a British Committee of India National Congress was founded. In 1890, this committee started a journal called India. Dadabhai Naoroji spent a major part of his life and income in England in popularizing India's case among its people. A student of the Indian national movement sometimes gets confused when he reads loud professionals of professions of loyalty to the British rule by the prominent moderate leaders. These professions do not at all mean that they were not genuine patriots or that they were cowardly men. They genuinely believed that the continuation of India's political connection with Britain was in the interest of India at the stage of history. They therefore planned not to expel the British but to transform the British rule to approximate the national rule. Later, when they took note of the evils of the British rule and the failure of the government to accept nationalist demands for reform, many of them stopped talking of the loyalty of the British rule and started demanding self government for India. Moreover, many of them were moderates because they felt that the time was not yet ripe to throw a direct challenge to the foreign rulers. Role of the masses. The basic weakness of the early national movement lay in its narrow social base. It did not yet penetrate down to the masses. In fact, the leaders lacked political faith in the masses. Describing the difficulties in the way of organization of active political struggle, Gopal Krishna Gokhale pointed out to endless divisions and subdivisions in the country, the bulk of the population ignorant and changing with tenacity to the old modes of thought and sentiment, which are averse to all changes and do not understand change. Thus, the moderate leaders believed that the militant mass struggle against colonial rule could be waged only after the heterogeneous elements of Indian society had been welded into a nation. But in fact, it was mainly in the course of such a struggle that the Indian nation could be get formed. The result of this wrong approach towards the masses was that the masses were assigned a passive role in the early phase of national movement. It also led to political moderation lacking support of the masses. They could not adopt a militant political position. As we shall see, the later nationalists were to differ from the moderates in precisely this respect. The narrow social base of the early national movement should not, however, be led to a conclusion that it fought for the narrow interests of the social groups which joined it. Its programs and policies championed the cause of all sections of the Indian people and represented the interest of the emerging Indian nation against colonial domination. Attitude of the government. The British authorities were from the beginning hostile to the rising nationalist movement and had become suspicious of the National Congress. Dufferin, the viceroy, had tried to divert the national movement by suggesting to Hume that the Congress should devote itself to social rather than political affairs. But the Congress leaders had refused to make this change. It soon became a tool in the hands of the authorities, and that it was gradually becoming a focus in the Indian nationalism. British officials now began to openly criticize and condemn the National Congress and other nationalist spokesmen. British officials from Dufferin downwards began to brand the nationalist leaders as disloyal babus, seditious Brahmins, and violent villains. The Congress was described as a factory of sedition. In 1887, Dufferin attacked the National Congress in a public speech and ridiculed it as representing only a microscopic minority of the people. In 1900, Lord Curzon announced to the Secretary of State that the Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions while in India is to assist it to its peaceful demise. Realizing that the growing unity of Indian people posed a major threat to their rule, the British authorities also pushed further the policy of divide and rule. They encouraged Sayyid Ahmed Khan, Raja Shiva Prasad of Benares, and other pro-British individuals to start an anti-Congress movement. They also tried to drive a wedge between Hindus and Muslims. They followed the policy of minor concessions on one hand and ruthless repression on the other to put down the growth of nationalism. Opposition by the authorities failed, however, in checking the growth of the national movement. Evaluation of the early national movement. According to some critics, the national movement of the National Congress did not achieve much success in their early phase. Very few of these reforms for which nationalists agitated were introduced by the government. There is a great deal of truth in this criticism, but the critics are not quite correct in declaring the early national movement a failure. Historically viewed, its record is quite bright if the immediate difficulties of the task they had undertaken are kept in view. It represented the most progressive force of the time. It succeeded in creating a wide national awakening, in arousing among the people the feeling that they belonged to one common nation. The Indian, conscious of the bonds of common political, economic, and social cultural interests, and the existence of the common enemy in the imperialism, and thus helped to weld them in a common nationality. It trained people in the art of political work, popularized among them the ideas of democracy, civil liberties, secularism, and nationalism, propagated among a modern outlook, and exposed before them the evil results of British rule. Most of all, the early nationalists did pioneering work in mercilessly exposing the true character of British imperialism in India. They linked nearly every important economic question with politically dependent status of the country. Their powerful economic critique of imperialism was to serve as the main plank of nationalist agitation in the later year of active mass struggle against British imperialism. They had, by their economic agitation, undermined the moral foundations of the British rule by exposing its cruel exploitative character. The early national movement also evolved a common political and economic program around which Indian people could gather and wage political struggles later on. It established the political truth that India must be ruled in the interest of Indians. It made the issue of nationalism a dominant one in Indian life. Moreover, the political work of the moderates was based on a concrete study and analysis of the hard reality of life of the people rather than a narrow appeals of true religion, more emotion, or shallow sentiments. While the weaknesses of the early movement were to be removed by the succeeding generations, its achievements were to serve as a base for more vigorous national movement in later years. It can therefore be said that in spite of their many weaknesses, the early nationalists laid strong foundation for the national movement to grow upon, and that they deserve a high place among the makers of modern India. Thank you everyone. This was part 3, chapter number 9, Growth of New India. I hope you liked this chapter. This was a lengthy chapter indeed, but this is what the syllabus tells us to do. So, all in all the best everyone. Thank you for tuning in and listening till the end. If you haven't subscribed yet, do subscribe and share this channel if you think anybody can use this. We will be starting very soon with chapter number 20, chapter number 10th. Yes, chapter number 10th. And all the best everyone. Thank you for listening.